can you give us some examples of where you have witnessed, okay, of how people have held themselves hostage in life? You've explained the theory, you've explained the possibilities, but what are some of the examples you have personally encountered in the course of your work, without, of course, mentioning the specific anything that can make us identify the person, so that people can see how this works in practicals?
Yes, I can. And I'm going to start with a true life story. Oh, this is going back several years. When I first joined the police department, I was on the department for about 2 years, and I was a single man unit, which means that I was traveling in a police cruiser by myself and responding to calls, and I was on the night shift. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was a very cold October night or a morning. I had my jacket on, and I had my heater on in my car, and I remember just driving around and waiting for the night to progress so that I could go to bed, because it's the graveyard shift, right?
Okay.
So the graveyard shift, they call it. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a 911 call, a call for help. Two ambulance attendants were calling for help. They had just been assaulted by a very violent man, and they were calling for police assistance. I happened to be in the general vicinity, so I responded to the call. I'd had 2 years on, and I pulled up to the area. It was a high-rise, low-income area, lots of tall buildings, and I called my name, or my actual handle was 1712. That was the call handle for my police unit. And I said, 1712 to control, I will take that call. So I pulled in, and I stopped about 30 feet away from the ambulance. I could see it in the distance. And it was stopped, and I could see two ambulance attendants seated outside the ambulance holding their heads. I didn't want to pull up to the ambulance because one never knows what you're going to encounter, especially on a 911 call. You have no idea what you're going into. So I stopped in my car, I got out, and I carefully closed the door so it wouldn't make any noise. And I started to walk up towards the ambulance attendants who had called for help. And from my left, I looked over, and about 30 feet away from me and from them was this hulk of a man, a huge man, about 6'1", 6'2". He was built, lots of muscles, and he had his fists clenched. He was making noise. He was grunting. He was looking up at the sky, and it was like a scene out of a movie, really. And he had long, straggly hair. And I just remember he appeared in stress, in a deep amount of stress. When I walked up to the ambulance attendants, I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, that's Jimmy Donovan." I can use his name because I use it in many of my keynotes. And they said, "That's Jimmy Donovan." And I said, "Who's Jimmy Donovan?" They said, "You don't know? You must be new." And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Well, he is the most violent criminal that we've ever encountered. He's very angry. He's assaulted us both. He's suffering some kind of a head problem. There's a migraine. There's something going on, but we are not taking him to the hospital. He's all yours. And you'd better get some backup because he's dangerous." And so they jump in their ambulance and they leave. And there I am, 30 feet away from my vehicle, with a very angry man who's almost shouting at the moon. That's the way it was. If you've ever seen the movie The Hulk, Ragnarok, where Thor is standing there with his face clenched, that was this guy. And I thought to myself, oh, there's one. That it was very cold, right? The only thing that he was wearing was a pair of white underwear. He wasn't wearing anything else, just this white pair of underwear, howling at the moon. And so I decided I was going to walk very quietly back to my car. And I did that. I started to walk, and I thought, okay, what do you do? What do you do? And you get inside your car, you lock the door, and you call for backup because this person is apparently very violent, and you are out in the open. Imagine this, Dr. Ope and dear listeners, if he was a bull, and he was a bull out there, I was the matador. I was the one wearing the uniform that he didn't like, and he was about to charge. He didn't see me yet. So I made my way to the cruiser, but when I was about 5 feet away from the car, something happened. My radio went off, and it was my dispatcher asking me if everything was okay. And they said 1712 to control, is everything 10-4. And that let out this noise that interrupted him when he was looking up at the moon. He then looked at me, and he went into this kind of this position in which I was now his target. And I thought, oh dear, I am going to die. And I thought, if I run to my car, is it possible for me to get in? I'm 5 feet away, but the door's on the other side. And I remembered from my training, I wasn't going to make it into the car. And so the first thing that came to me, Dr. Ope, was to put my hands up in this way to show that I had nothing in my hands, that I was not a threat. And these are the words that came out of my mouth. I'm here to help you. You look cold. Why don't I get you a blanket from the back? And he looked at me, and he was in a very angry state. He said nothing, and he followed me to the back trunk. I opened the trunk, and I took out a blanket, and I put it around his shoulders. And I said, the ambulance attendants are not coming back for you. So why don't I take you to the hospital? Now, what I did next, I don't know if it was God. I don't know this whole thing, I can't explain it. But I had a briefcase in the passenger seat next to me, and I moved it into the back seat where normally prisoners and passengers go. The front seat is usually for police officers, but I had him sit in the front with me, and I sat in the driver's seat, and he closed the door. I closed the door, and I remember telling you that the heater was on, and he had a blanket, and all he was wearing was his underwear. You know what happened? He put his head down, and he started to cry. And I picked up my radio, and I called in. I said 1712 to control. I have Jimmy Donovan on board, and I'm taking him to the Oshawa General Hospital. The moment I said that, so many police officers were trying to get on the band, the radio waves, to say, he's crazy, be careful, he's dangerous. And all these things came out, and I'm looking at Jimmy with his head down, who's weeping, and I turned the radio down because I didn't want him to hear those words. And I drove him to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, the hospital attendants were ready for us, and they had a room because they did not want to have Jimmy in the lobby along with other medical people and any patients. So we went to this room, and we sat, and Jimmy and I started to talk. And we had this really nice conversation going on. And he was sitting on the examination table, and I was seated in a chair with my back to the door. We were waiting for the doctor. But all of a sudden, that door opened, and about 4 police officers tried to get in that door at a time. They were trying to squeeze in together. This was back in 1979, 1980. One had his gun out, another one had his billy club out, and the other 2 were just trying to squeeze in. And I imagined that they wanted to get a piece of Jimmy for some of the things that Jimmy had done, because Jimmy liked to beat on police officers. It usually took about 6 or 7 police officers to take him down, to arrest him. He was very strong and violent. He was missing most of his teeth. He had scars on his face and scars on his body. He was not a very pretty man. He was strong, and he was a hardened criminal. And so these guys jump in. Jimmy is sitting very quietly on the examination table. And what does Jimmy do? He throws off his blanket. He jumps on the ground. He gets in that position that he got in before, and he gets into his Hulk position. And now there's a challenge, and I'm right in the middle of it. The police officers against Jimmy. And I thought, I'm going to die. what am I going to do? And so I decided, okay, first thing I was going to do, I turned around and I looked at the police officers, my fellow officers, and I shouted at them. I said, you guys, get out of here. If I need you, I will call you. You either come in when I call you or when you hear me dying. So get out of here. And I looked at Jimmy and I pointed at him and I said, Jimmy, sit down. And Jimmy sat down. And everything was calm. We sat down and Jimmy and I continued the conversation. There was no need for the police. The doctor came in, gave him a shot about 45 minutes later. Now it was about 3:30 in the morning and it was time to go home. So I said to Jimmy, Jimmy, I'm going to take you home. And so Jimmy jumped in the cruiser and we started to talk. And Jimmy looks over at me, Dr. Ope, and he says, you know, Paul, and he was calling me by my first name. And this is really important. When you start to make a connection with someone, he wasn't calling me Officer Nadeau. That was a big thing. It's like in business. We don't try to use people's titles. We try to connect with them on a first name. And Jimmy and I were talking on our first name. He says, you know, Paul, he says, you are the nicest policeman I've ever met. And I said, well, thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. At the time, I was going to church and this wonderful church. And I had these religious tracts with me. And I pulled one of these tracts out and I wrote my phone number down. And I said, Jimmy, if ever you would like to go to church, I would be happy to bring you. So just think about it. And he says, oh, I don't know, Paul. I said, I'm going to leave you with my phone number. Just think about it. And he took the tract and he held it because he didn't have any clothes other than his white underwear. So we get to his place, this tall high rise, and he says, would you like to meet my fiance? And I said, well, it's 3:30, almost 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'm thinking, why not? I mean, why not? So I imagined in my mind.
You are still alive, right? That I'm still alive. So it's okay. I'm winning.
Yes, I'm still alive. Why not? And and the funny thing, I was imagining what she must look like because Jimmy he was a very violent man. And he wasn't he was at one time very attractive. I think his features were nice, but now his face was scarred, missing most of his teeth, his long, scraggly hair.
Policeman probably broke those teeth now. Maybe your brothers broke those teeth.
I'm thinking the same thing. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Go on.
So I'm thinking she must not be a very pretty girl, but heck, this is going to be fun. And so when we get to his floor and outside of his door, the door was opened by this beautiful, beautiful young woman wearing a floral dress. I can remember it to this day. And she, in the softest, most beautiful voice, she said, thank you, officer, for bringing my Jimmy home. And I said, you're very welcome. So I left them after a very brief, hello and very nice to meet you. And I went back to the police station and I finished my shift. I never thought
in uniform. Were you in uniform?
I was in uniform, full uniform.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
Even to the hat. We had to wear our hats back then too.
Wow. Okay.
And here I am with this encounter with the most violent criminal. In fact, Dr. Ope, Jimmy had done some serious time in a penitentiary we have here in Canada for manslaughter. And he was put on what we call a kill squad. They had taken some prisoners, some hostages, and Jimmy's job was to kill the hostages if their demands weren't met. He was in jail for armed robbery. He had done very vicious assaults before. He was your typical, very, very violent offender. And that was the man that I was dealing with.
Let me connect this.
So 2 weeks go by, and
but go ahead, finish it up. So I was going to connect it. Go ahead, finish up the story. Go ahead.
It's coming. It's coming. Okay. I always come. So what happened next is that I get a phone call, and it was from Jimmy's fiance. They wanted to go to church. And so I brought them to church the first week. Jimmy was dressed in a nice suit. She looked amazing. We went to church. The pastor greeted us. He shook our hands. He welcomed us. And nobody came to say hello to Jimmy. The congregation, nobody came to say hello. And we listened to the pastor's message about love and about welcoming people and really, really about connecting with human beings, no matter what. The second week happened. The third week happened, and nobody came to us. Nobody came at all. Here's where I believe that congregation was taken hostage. There's some feedback there, but yeah, here's what happened. Nobody from that congregation. Yep. Nobody from that congregation came to say hello. Nobody came to welcome Jimmy or his fiance. No, none of my friends came to say hello to me. They judged Jimmy on his past and who he was. And here's where I believe that this is an example where I've witnessed how people have held themselves hostage to the beliefs that they had before, that all bad people are going to be bad people all the time. And this was their belief, even though the pastor was spreading the word of love and acceptance. And this happens when we have these preconceived notions and we attach a label to someone. They are different than us. Maybe their skin color is different, so I can't like them. Maybe their religious beliefs are different, so I can't like them. Maybe they have a criminal background, so I could never accept them into my life. This is where they keep themselves hostage to the beliefs that somebody else has given them or the ones that they have entertained. The thing is, Jimmy came to church and was looking for a new beginning, and nobody welcomed him. 5 weeks went by, nobody welcomed Jimmy. And so he finally said, no, I'm not coming back. And I said, I understand, Jimmy. I'm so sorry. And the good message that the pastor spread, nobody listened to. They all stayed in their comfort zones. They all stayed in their shell and in their bubble. And Jimmy left our jurisdiction a little while later. And about 2 years later, he was living in a different province. And I was on shift again one night when our sergeant walked in. And he said to us, he said, anybody remember Jimmy Donovan? And Jimmy Donovan had become my friend. He had stopped his criminal activity after he met me. And I said, yeah, we all do. And a lot of my comrades did not like the fact that I had become Jimmy's friend. And Jimmy had changed. And so he had changed when he was here, when he was in this jurisdiction that I lived in at the time. And the staff sergeant says, well, you won't have to worry about Jimmy anymore. He was shot dead by the police last night in a police shootout. And it hit me. That was my friend. It hit me that,
whoa.
Yeah. And I felt so emotional because I knew that Jimmy had an opportunity to change his whole life around if only he had been accepted by the congregation and people who could welcome him. And I felt so saddened by that. And I still feel it today. Just talking about it, I feel a little emotional because I know that we could have changed this man's life. So when you ask me, can you share an example of how something that I witnessed on how people hold themselves hostage in business, it is by that, is by prejudging someone and staying put and not making the offer, not accepting somebody. Your judgment, if you are locked into a preconceived judgment of someone based on they're homeless, they're no good. They're criminals, they're no good. They're terrorists, they're no good. Well, a terrorist saved my life. In the Middle East, a terrorist saved my life in 2005. I was about to be killed, and a terrorist saved my life. So I know that people can be reached. And if we hostage ourselves to those thoughts that they must all be bad and they're going to stay bad, I'm not even going to try to reach out and say hello. I'm not going to try to reach out and change the way in which people see you or the way I see you. I'm not going to listen. That's where people hold themselves hostage. They do it in life and they do it in business. And in business, it may be
100%.
Yep. So those are my thoughts.
Wow, that is profound. And for me to have even allowed you to finish it tells you how good that story was. I'm typically a very impatient host, but I'm learning. That was a great story. And I think it basically also reinforces how we hold ourselves hostage as a people, as even in tribe. We see it in my country, Nigeria, for instance. This thing you are saying is also playing out every day, where people from a certain tribe, they see somebody from another tribe, and they just judge him based on the preconceived notion of that tribe. You know, I'm from the Yoruba tribe. I'm very proud of it, right? Many of my people, for instance, they take a look at maybe the Igbos, and they have this already preconceived notion about them, regardless of who that person is. The Igbos too may look at us and see, many of them say there's nothing good in being a Yoruba person, and that has held our nation hostage. And especially when one tribe is in power, like right now the Yorubas are in power, what you're going to find out over the next 4 years, the rest of the country probably going to hate that tribe, because that's what we did when the Hausas were in power, the people in the north. You find out that those in the east and the west, they basically bound together to just hate on the tribe. Now, while there might have been some justifications with individuals doing bad stuff, but we all play this game where we tend to project on people of that. Same thing happening in America, where it's like you see people holding themselves hostage, not even just to color, to also political beliefs. If you say you are a Trump supporter, a Biden person automatically projects Trump's characteristics on you, or the hatred of Trump on you. Same way, those of us who are Republicans, when you take a look at the Democrats, you are trying to judge them based on some of the policies. Meanwhile, the individual you are talking to may be totally different. So it's a good story to tell, and it can lead to tragic consequences, as you just pointed out. This self-hostage to limiting beliefs, to beliefs that we grew up from our parents. So